There exists within the human soul a strange phenomenon, one that walks the fine line between light and shadow. These are the ones we call empaths, those individuals whose psychic boundaries are so porous they absorb the emotional contents of others as if they were their own. But beneath this seeming virtue lies a truth few dare to speak. For what is commonly admired as deep sensitivity may, when viewed through a deeper lens, conceal a perilous descent into the unconscious. The empath by nature is a mirror. They reflect the pain, sorrow, joy, and confusion of those around them. But what happens when a mirror forgets it is a mirror? When it begins to believe that what it reflects is truly its own. The danger here is not merely emotional exhaustion, it is identification. The empath loses the boundary between self and other, and in doing so opens the door to psychic possession. This is not poetic language, it is psychological fact. When we are overwhelmed by the affective energies of others and do not recognize them as foreign, they begin to colonize the soul. The empath then lives not as a whole person, but as a vessel filled with fragments that do not belong to them. People often speak of empaths as healers, as though their task were to endlessly absorb the darkness of others. But this is a naive and romantic illusion. The psyche does not permit unbalanced exchange without consequence. To feel everything is not wisdom, it is exposure. The unconscious is ruthless in its demand for equilibrium, and if the empath suppresses their own emotions in order to carry those of others, the shadow grows stronger. What is denied will always seek a way to manifest, if not through dreams and neuroses, then through projection, self-sabotage, or illness. The empath who cannot distinguish between their inner world and the outer world becomes vulnerable not only to the pain of others, but to their manipulation, their complexes, their darkness. There is also an ethical danger. The one who believes they know how others feel is often unaware of their own projections. Empathy, when unchecked, can become a subtle form of control, a way of assuming knowledge of another's inner life while bypassing genuine dialogue. This is the hidden arrogance within compassion that has not been reflected upon. True understanding is not absorption. It is recognition of the other as distinct, autonomous, and unknowable in their full depth. The empath, if they are to evolve, must confront their own desire to merge. They must resist the temptation to play savior, and instead undergo the painful task of individuation, separating what is theirs from what is not. Moreover, the origin of the empath's nature often lies in early wounding. Children who grow up in chaotic emotional environments often develop heightened sensitivity as a survival strategy. They learn to feel what others feel because their safety depends on it, but what once served as protection becomes a prison. The adult empath continues the same pattern unconsciously, never realizing that what they call sensitivity may in fact be hypervigilance, a fear of abandonment dressed as compassion. Without confronting this, they will continue to sacrifice their own soul to maintain harmony in relationships that may not deserve it. In the mythic imagination, the wounded healer archetype reminds us that healing does not come from avoiding pain, but from descending into it consciously. The empath who does not investigate the darker roots of their nature will forever be consumed by the energies they attract. They will mistake enmeshment for intimacy, pain for purpose, and depletion for virtue. To live as an empath is not a calling to remain open at all costs. It is a summons to walk the edge, to discern, to guard the sanctity of the self while engaging the other with awareness. Only through this tension, between compassion and boundaries, between feeling and reflection, can the empath transform from a passive absorber into an integrated human being, and only then can they truly be of service, not as a mirror, but as a presence. The empath often exists in a state of psychological openness so wide that the border between self and other becomes nearly invisible. This openness, often admired as a gift, carries within it a hidden cost that is seldom acknowledged. When one is so attuned to the emotions of others, they risk unconsciously identifying with them. It is not merely a matter of feeling with someone, it becomes a quiet merging, a psychic absorption. The empath begins to feel sorrow that is not theirs, anxiety that has no personal origin, guilt that belongs to someone else entirely. This is not empathy in its highest form. It is possession. The self becomes a container for the unresolved contents of other people's psyches. This kind of identification is dangerous precisely because it is unconscious. The empath is often unaware that what they are feeling does not belong to them. They may interpret these feelings as part of their own internal landscape and begin to mold their thoughts and actions in response. Their moods shift with the emotional climate around them. Their sense of identity becomes unstable, fluid, reactive. In extreme cases, they no longer know where they end and the other begins. What looks like compassion on the outside may in fact be the slow erosion of personal boundaries from within. Without inner work and reflection, the empath is like a sponge, drifting in a storm, soaking in chaos, unable to differentiate between what is authentic and what is foreign. In psychological terms, this identification is a failure of ego boundaries. The ego is not the enemy of empathy, it is the structure that allows discernment. When the ego is too weak or too compliant, it cannot defend the sanctity of the inner world. This is especially true for those whose sense of self has not been fully formed or has been compromised through early emotional trauma. Such individuals develop a heightened sensitivity as a means of psychic survival, and that sensitivity later masquerades as intuition. But what they are actually doing is scanning others constantly, tuning into the needs and emotions of those around them to maintain connection, harmony, or safety. This scanning becomes second nature. Over time, they forget that this is a defense mechanism and begin to believe it is simply who they are. What emerges is a personality that is shaped more by its environment than by its essence. The empath, unprotected by firm psychological borders, becomes a collage of everyone they've ever known, ever helped, ever loved. Their values are fluid, their decisions heavily influenced by the emotional expectations of others. They may even begin to attract people who unconsciously sense this permeability and exploit it. The empath then takes on the role of emotional caretaker, drawn into cycles of codependency and sacrifice. But beneath the surface, the soul starts to fragment. The more they carry what is not theirs, the more estranged they become from what is. The psychic consequences of such identification are significant. The unconscious begins to rebel. What has been taken in but not integrated starts to manifest through anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, and even psychosomatic illness. The psyche cannot tolerate foreign material indefinitely without consequence. It demands differentiation, not enmeshment. And yet the empath, driven by a desire to alleviate suffering, often suppresses their own needs and discomforts in favor of others. This sets the stage for a kind of inner collapse, a quiet implosion where the self disappears under the weight of emotional debris that was never meant to be carried in the first place. To navigate the world as an empath is to walk a razor's edge. Without awareness, the sensitivity that connects them to others can slowly consume them. What is needed is not less empathy, but deeper reflection, an ability to pause and ask, "Is this mine?" Such a question seems simple, but it requires a level of psychological maturity that many do not reach. Because the empath does not merely feel for others, they begin to become them. The empathic disposition, so often romanticized as a spiritual gift, frequently has its origins in early psychological injury. In many cases, what presents as heightened sensitivity in adulthood is rooted in a childhood where emotional chaos, unpredictability, or neglect were the norm. A child growing up in such an environment learns, not out of choice but necessity, to attune themselves acutely to the emotional states of those around them, particularly the caregivers on whom their survival depends. This hyper-attunement is not love, it is strategy. It is the body and psyche developing tools for vigilance, emotional scanning, and adaptation in order to avoid harm or gain fleeting moments of affection or safety. This type of early environment shapes a psychic blueprint, where the child begins to define their sense of self through the needs and moods of others. If a parent is angry, the child feels responsible. If a parent is sad, the child feels it must be fixed. If a parent withdraws emotionally, the child interprets this as evidence of their own inadequacy. Over time, the child internalizes the belief that their safety and worth are contingent upon being emotionally useful, perceptive, and agreeable. This is the birthplace of the empath, the one who learns to feel everything because not feeling would mean danger. The tragedy is that such a child never develops the space to explore who they are apart from these relational dynamics. Their emotional life becomes a mirror, always reflecting but never originating. As this child matures into adulthood, the patterns persist. They may be drawn to relationships where they are the listener, the caretaker, the fixer. On the surface, this appears noble, but underneath is often a fear of abandonment and a deeply embedded belief that love must be earned through self-erasure. They become uncomfortable with attention directed at their own needs, and even when in pain, they instinctively minimize or redirect it to others. This is not altruism. It is unresolved trauma. Their empathy is not always born from compassion, but from fear, a need to anticipate emotional danger before it strikes. This state of constant emotional alertness becomes exhausting, but they may not know any other way to exist. Moreover, this internalized dynamic creates a complex relationship with boundaries. The empath often feels guilty for saying no, for prioritizing themselves, or for creating distance. This is because in childhood, boundaries may have been punished or ignored. Thus, the adult empath confuses self-protection with selfishness, and self-sacrifice with love. They carry within them a silent contract that says, "If I take care of your feelings, you won't abandon me." But this contract is invisible to others and often unmet, leading to chronic disappointment and resentment. The empath continues giving, hoping to be seen, while unconsciously repeating the emotional wounds of their past. In addition, the empath's sensitivity often masks a disconnection from their own deeper emotional needs. They are so focused outward, so attuned to the storms of others, that they lose touch with the inner terrain of their own soul. Their desires, their anger, their sadness remain unspoken or unexplored. The outer focus is, in a way, a defense against turning inward, where they would have to confront the unresolved grief of not having been emotionally protected themselves. Their empathy becomes a distraction from their own healing, and unless they bring this into consciousness, they will continue to attract relationships and environments that mirror their original wounds, reenacting the same cycles in different forms. This is the darker truth behind the empathic personality. It is not always a divine gift bestowed on the emotionally enlightened. Often it is the result of a child's nervous system adapting to what it was never meant to endure. Recognizing this origin does not diminish the beauty of empathy, it deepens it. Because only when the empath understands the roots of their sensitivity can they begin to make choices from a place of awareness rather than compulsion. Only then can they learn to distinguish between true compassion and the survival pattern of emotional overextension. The task, then, is to reclaim the pieces of themselves they gave away before they even knew who they were. Empathy, when left unchecked and unexamined, can quietly evolve into something far more complex and ethically ambiguous than mere understanding or compassion. The empath, convinced of their deep connection to the inner experiences of others, often begins to operate from an unconscious assumption that they know what someone else feels, needs, or means. This assumption, while cloaked in the language of care, is actually a psychological overreach. When one claims to feel or intuit what another is experiencing without inquiry or confirmation, they step into the realm of projection. They are no longer relating to the actual person but to their own internal image of that person, an image shaped by their emotional history, unconscious expectations, and unresolved patterns. This form of projection is subtle and often well-intentioned, which makes it even more dangerous. The empath may genuinely believe they are helping, supporting, or validating, but in reality they may be silencing the true experience of the other person, imposing their own narrative onto them and responding to that projection rather than to the actual human being before them. It becomes a kind of psychic colonization where the empathic individual believing they are emotionally merging with another, is actually intruding into emotional space that is not theirs to claim. Without realizing it, they rob the other person of their autonomy, their mystery, and their right to define their own emotional experience. Additionally, this unchecked empathy often serves as a hidden mechanism of control. The empath may unconsciously use their sensitivity to manage the emotional dynamics of a relationship. If they perceive discomfort or tension in another, they rush to soothe it, not only out of concern but also to restore their own sense of safety. This is not compassion in its purest form, it is emotional self-regulation disguised as altruism. The empath is not just helping the other. They are managing their own anxiety about relational disharmony. Over time, this dynamic creates an invisible power imbalance. The empath becomes the one who knows, who understands, who feels everything, while the other is passively placed in the role of someone to be helped, fixed, or interpreted. This kind of relationship structure can become suffocating, even if it appears harmonious on the surface. The one on the receiving end may begin to feel misunderstood, trapped in an emotional narrative they did not author. They may feel guilty for setting boundaries, confused about their own feelings, or subtly manipulated by the empath's perceived goodness. Because the empath rarely appears aggressive or domineering, the control they exert is difficult to name or resist. It is the control of the helper, the quiet authority of the one who believes they know what is best for others, because they can feel what others cannot articulate. This dynamic erodes authenticity in relationships, replacing mutual exchange with emotional hierarchy. Furthermore, this mode of behavior allows the empath to avoid their own deeper work. By focusing on others' emotions and needs, they can remain distracted from their own unresolved grief, rage, or longing. They may even develop a kind of emotional superiority, priding themselves on their sensitivity while unconsciously suppressing darker aspects of their psyche. They disown their aggression, their jealousy, their need for power, and project those qualities onto others. In doing so, they become identified with the light and blind to the shadow. This makes them vulnerable to psychological inflation. The quiet egoism of believing one's emotional insight grants moral clarity or spiritual elevation. To engage in true empathy requires humility, boundaries, and a willingness to not know. It demands that one recognize the other as a sovereign being with an interior life that may never be fully understood, no matter how attuned one feels. Without this restraint, empathy becomes something else entirely, a mask worn by the ego, a vessel for control, a theater where unresolved emotional scripts are endlessly rehearsed. The task, then, is not to abandon empathy but to discipline it, to ground it in self-awareness, and to strip it of its illusions of omniscience.